Analysis of At the Border 1979 by Choman Hardi for the AQA GCSE Literature exam. At the Border 1979. It is your last check-in point in this country. We grabbed a drink. Soon everything would taste different. The land under our feet continued, divided by a thick iron chain. My sister put her leg across it. "Look over here," she said to us. "My right leg is in this country and my left leg in the other." The border guards told her off. My mother informed me, "We are going home." She said that the roads are much cleaner, the landscape is more beautiful, and people are much kinder. Dozens of families waited in the rain. "I can inhale home," somebody said. Now our mothers were crying. I was 5 years old, standing by the check-in point comparing both sides of the border. The autumn soil continued on the other side with the same colour, the same texture. It rained on both sides of the chain. We waited while our papers were checked, our faces thoroughly inspected. Then the chain was removed to let us through. A man bent down and kissed his muddy homeland. The same chain of mountains encompassed all of us. Right, analysing this with flirts, form, language, imagery, rhythm, rhyme, tone and subject. We are starting with subject to get a clear idea about what the poem is about, and then tie in all of the rest of the devices and see how that fits in. Right, this poem is a personal memory of the poet Choman Hardi from 1979, which is why that's in the title, when she was 5 years old, and it describes the crossing of the Iranian border into Iraq. Choman Hardi is Kurdistan, which is an area to the north of Iraq. They'd moved to Iran, but because of persecution they then had to move back to Iraq. A little bit of context here. They were then, as Kurdistans, were persecuted in Iraq as well under the government of Saddam Hussein, and had to move again. So that there is a sense of there is an idea towards the end, which we'll look at, that it's going to repeat. History is going to repeat itself, and that they are going to be persecuted again, and they will need to move on. And they did, and they immigrated to England, to the UK, which is where she now lives. So in form, we've got these four quotations here, and it's written in free verse, which I'll talk about in rhythm. So there, again, like some of the other poems that we've looked at, there is a variation to the lengths of stanzas and lines, and as you can see with those quotations, the poem explores different perspectives. It starts off with the perspective of the guard, with that line of dialogue, but mainly it is from the perspective of the family. Now, through this variation of stanzas and lines, it's kind of conveying the theme of borders, and it's quite clear through reading the poem how the poet is kind of reflecting on the arbitrary nature of borders. Arbitrary meaning random, imposed by man, by humankind. This is not something that is that is natural. There are natural borders, mountain ranges, rivers, coastlines, etc. But borders in landlocked countries are arbitrary, and they're not really showing any real differences between land, between people, but they are imposed by the people in governments. By differing the perspectives in the poem, it gives a holistic description. In other words, it kind of covers all angles, as it were. It's not just affecting the poet, it's affecting her family, and also there are other families involved as well. With language, I've used a few quotes here. Land under our feet continued, cleaner, more beautiful, much kinder, comparing. There's lots of first person pronouns within the poem. The language is plain, simple and quite straightforward. It's not the flowery poetic language that one might expect in a poem. And there's lots of uses of comparatives. Comparatives being cleaner, kinder and more beautiful. In other words, it's an adjective. Comparative is a type of adjective that compares two things. So we have clean as an adjective, then cleaner is the comparative. Then cleanest is the superlative, but you don't need to worry about that necessarily here. Cleaner and kinder and more beautiful, because we don't say beautifuler, we say more beautiful. They're comparatives. So the simple language and the first person pronouns highlights that, you know, this is an autobiographical poem. This is a real event, and whilst I would imagine it would have been tempting to use poetic language in order to create a more a vivid description, the poet has avoided this, and I think really it's because she wants to describe the memory in the language of her 5-year-old self. It's made quite clear that it's 1979 and that this is nostalgic. It says about being 5 years old somewhere in the poem, which I can't find which line it was. Yes, line 17. I was 5 years old. So we do get a sense that we are seeing this initially, you know, from a 5-year-old perspective, as it were. Now, by using the comparatives, kind of puts across this theme of comparison and border. We place a border and then we look at both sides. Essentially, you know, the grass is greener on the other side is a way that would sum up the message of this poem, as it were. The comparatives, they show, they're quite positive, and they're conveying the emotions of the people, of the mother, of their homeland. And it's quite romanticized view, attitude of their homeland. Now, by romantic, when we say that we have a romanticized view, we're not necessarily talking about, you know, love, etc., but an idealized view of their homeland. The comparatives, they suggest difference, and the people feel that they are going to somewhere that is better simply because it is their home. Now, the imagery, there's quite clearly the image of the thick iron chain. Again, we're going to talk about the comparatives, and then the idea of the continuity. The autumn soil continued, it rained on both sides. The border image is central to the poem. It's in the title, and then we have the thick iron chain. That's the sister puts her leg across, and this idea that yes, there is a border and there are these two countries, but we can stand on both sides. There are romanticized images of home, and these are juxtaposed with quite dull images, actually. That, you know, that it's raining. The very next line, line 15, which follows the comparatives of the mother. Landscapes are more beautiful and people are much kinder. Dozens of families waited in the rain. So it's not really suggesting a nice, you know, welcome home, as it were. But also these romanticized images are juxtaposed with images suggesting similarity. We have the excitement as well of the adults, the man kissing the floor, etc., etc., and the child, the children are bored. The sister is playing, and they're, you know, they're getting told off by the guard, and so there's that contrast there. So the central image of the border highlights the themes of difference that is explored in the poem. Despite the guards, despite the chain, despite the imposed arbitrary border, the landscape and climate are identical. There is no difference, and the poem explores that in quite clearly. The excitement of the adults shows this romanticized view, probably because they remember their home more, and a 5-year-old child won't necessarily remember a great deal. So the adults remember, and you often, through memory and have this nostalgic view, you have this idealized view of your home. The juxtaposition of waiting in the rain on both sides, and then the continuity of the land, reinforces the arbitrary nature of the borders, and that they are random, that they are imposed by man. The borders and the differences are man-made, and therefore they can be broken down. Now, rhythm and rhyme. I've provided 2 stanzas there, and these stanzas, these are the first 2 stanzas of the poem, and these show how the poem is written in free verse. You see the one stanza looks completely different to the second stanza. We also see use of end stops now. End stops means punctuation at the end, so like the full stops at the end of the 3rd line and then the 5th line, but also enjambment. Enjambment, as you are no doubt aware, is when one line flows completely smoothly into the next without any punctuation. Now, with it being written in free verse, this shows the nature, the random nature of borders. Through free verse, the poet is able to control and create her own borders in the way that she divides her lines and stanzas, in the same way that men and governments are able to apply their own borders to the world. The end stops clearly define borders. The closing of the line suggests a border, and then the use of enjambment highlights this continuity and similarity between countries. So moving on finally to tone, I've chosen quotes from the first and the last stanza there, and I think that there is a sense of hope in the poem. Perhaps this is comes mainly from the adults who have this romanticized view, and then in the poet's voice, I think that the poem closes on a note of despair. So, as we see, initially the poem conveys a sense of hope, through the image of home and the idealized attitudes of the families, particularly the adults. This romanticized idea that their home is going to be perfect is scotched by, it's removed, it's broken down, it's contradicted, it's contrasted by the repetition of images that show that everything's just the same. The rain is the same, the land is the same, the autumn soil continues. And in this final line, the same chain of mountains encompassed all of us. We get a sense of despair. Life isn't going to change for the better. In that line there are natural borders, the chain of mountains, which I think are quite a threatening image, because they encompass all of us, and they're just as threatening as the border guards at the start, and this gives a sense that the poets or the speakers, and the speaker is the poet in this case, the speaker's situation is not going to change. It's going to stay the same, and we know with the benefit of hindsight that this did happen, and life in Iraq was not perfect, and the family had to move once again and had to be refugees because of the government of Saddam Hussein.